So, without further ado, let's move on to the topic of today's show. We're talking about wealth inequality and asking the question, how much is too much? In the next 45 minutes, we'll be hearing two different perspectives from our guests. And of course, we want your perspective too. Tweet at us, and we'll try to read some of your comments later in the show. To explore wealth inequality, I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by Alison Schrager, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a City Journal contributing editor. She's a Bloomberg opinion columnist, the author of An Economist Walks into a Brothel, and the host of the podcast Risk Talking. I'm also joined by Gary Stevenson, an economist and former trader turned inequality campaigner. Having retired in his 20s, he writes and makes videos about inequality, including on his YouTube channel, which is called Gary's Economics. A warm welcome to both of you. Whilst I wait for our guests to get their microphones on, I think I can hear you, Alison. Is that you?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Not at all. Thank you very much for joining us. I think Gary is joining us imminently, any second. Gary,
I'm here. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Not at all. Happy to have you both. And thank you once again, both of you, for joining us. So let's begin with our opening positions, both of you, because wealth inequality is the unequal distribution of assets between people. So it's pretty much about what you own over and above income. So wealth inequality exists both between countries and also very much within countries. And we all know it's rarely out of the headlines. Last December, the World Economic Forum told us that the poorest half of the world owns just 2% of global wealth, while the richest 10% own 76% of all wealth. So I'm going to ask both of you this question, but to you, Alison Schrager, first of all, is that too much wealth equality? And if not, what would be too much?
Well, obviously, there's a point where inequality, wealth inequality in particular, can be too much. I think, for instance, North Korea is an example where it's too much, where almost everyone's desperately poor and one family has pretty much everything. But I think for the rest of the world, I think Gary and I really are in a lot of agreement in a lot of ways, and that I think the level of poverty is totally unacceptable and is far too high, although it is getting better. I say global inequality has been coming down quite a bit. But I don't think the level of inequality we have so much is the problem as the level of poverty is. And I don't think these are really the same thing. I don't see the economy as, and I think the evidence bears this out, as zero sum. Just because Jeff Bezos has so much money, it doesn't make someone else poorer in the Congo. I mean, as I said, the way to sort of relieve global poverty isn't to fight inequality. It is to sort of give opportunity and prosperity to everyone.
Thank you for that. Gary, I'd like to ask you your position on this. How much is too much wealth inequality? And what would be a fair level if there is such a thing?
I think the first thing we need to talk about when we talk about this is to make it very clear what we mean by wealth inequality, right? So this is not income inequality. This is not about your salary. This is not about your job. This is not about doctors and bankers versus farmers and shop workers. This is about who owns the resources in our economy. And when we talk about the resources, this includes housing, this includes land, this includes the farms, this includes natural resources, this includes our factories, this includes our food production and our energy production. So if wealth inequality gets very high, what this means is the vast majority of people don't own their own homes. Or if they do, they can only do so by borrowing a large amount of money from the rich. It means they don't own any share in food production. They don't own any share in energy production. Now, the converse is you have a more equal economy where everyone owns some natural resources. So, you know, in agricultural countries, that might mean people own their own farms. In countries, that means people own shares in the factories or the share market or the businesses in their economy. When this gets very unequal, what this means is essentially you have a large number of people who don't own their own home, have no way of making their own food, have no way of accessing the natural resources in the economy. On the flip side of that, you have a small number of people who own all of this stuff. And what this means is the vast majority of people end up paying almost all of their income every week, every month, every year to this tiny group of people who are very, very rich. And when we look at those very rich people, of course, they are receiving these enormous incomes from ordinary people every year. And we know that they spend a very low percentage of their income. Well, if they're not spending any money and they are receiving everybody's income every year, you end up with a very low spending economy. And also there's a question of what do these people do with the money once they get it? Well, if you look at what's happening, for example, in my country, I live in the UK in the last couple of years, by and large, these wealthy people, when they accumulate huge amounts of wealth and the huge income flows that come with it from ordinary people, they use that money to buy the rest of the wealth. So you end up with a very negative spiral where ordinary people end up having to sell, for example, their homes in order to pay for basic essentials, and those homes end up being owned by the rich. So it creates a very, very negative spiral, which means that wealth inequality goes up and up and up over time, and it inevitably leads to increasing poverty. I think nothing could make that clearer than what's happened in the last 3 years in the West, where we've seen the largest and fastest ever increase in wealth inequality, and it's been immediately followed by a collapse in living standards. So how much is too much? I would say this much.
Okay, Gary, that's really interesting. Let's try and summarize each other's arguments in a sentence or two. We want to make this conversation as constructive as possible, so let's try and build a clear understanding of our starting point. Alison, can you please, if possible, summarize Gary's argument as accurately as you can, but only in 1 or 2 sentences?
Well, Gary does see wealth, global wealth, as zero sum because he's defined it very narrowly as physical goods.
Okay. Was that accurate, Gary?
I mean, I wouldn't say so. I think, there's many forms of wealth, includes, for example, the stock market. No, I think there's many, many different forms of wealth. But I mean, I think even Alison would agree that the single largest source of wealth is physical assets such as property and land.
Okay. And Gary, can you tell me in a sentence or two how you would sum up Alison's argument here?
I think Alison is making, in a sense, the classic libertarian argument that there's a difference between distribution and sort of broad prosperity. I think in the very broad case, that is true. I mean, you can have a country that is to some degree unequal and still rich.
Okay.
The problem, yeah, okay, that's enough.
I'm stopping you because I did say a sentence or two, but I think you went to about 3 or 4 sentences. But you sum up her argument how?
I think she thinks that there's not a relationship between inequality and poverty.
Alison, is that accurate? Yes or no?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Okay, well, we've done our best to make sure that each speaker is acknowledging Alison's basic position and starting point. If you're just joining us, welcome. This is Doha Debates on Twitter Spaces. We are having a debate about wealth inequality with economists Gary Stevenson and Alison Schrager. If you have any questions or thoughts for our guests, please do tweet us at Doha Debates, and I'll do my best to bring your comments into the discussion. So let's get on with our main discussion. To both our guests, once again, thank you for joining us. Let's talk about, we talked about how much wealth is too much wealth. Let's talk about now what to do about it. What do you think is the best way to tackle global wealth inequality? I'd like to invite you both to respond, but Alison, let's start with you.
Well, as I said, I think it's important about sharing prosperity. I think it is more trade. I think it is looser immigration restrictions in the developed world, so everyone can, as I said, if we had a freer flow of capital and labor, then we would see a lot of inequality fall and sort of broader prosperity and a lot less poverty.
Gary, what do you think are the best ways to tackle global wealth inequality?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is to deal with tax evasion. I mean, we have a tax system which in general, and it's obviously different in each country, but in general, tax systems are very good at taxing people who work. So I worked in the city here in London for a few years. I made quite a lot of money. I made a few £1 million, and I had to pay 50% income tax on that. At the same time, we have a landed aristocracy in this country, and the Duke of Westminster inherited £9 billion and paid no tax. So, if we have a tax system where working people making millions of pounds pay 50%, whereas wealthy families earning billions of pounds pay 0%, then first of all, it's profoundly unfair. But secondly, it's inevitable that wealth inequality will get worse over time.
Alison, can you answer that? I mean, keep your microphone on, guys, so you can answer each other as and when you need to, because I want to kind of keep the conversation flowing between the both of you. But do you think that is the way forward, Alison? Does that make sense to you or not?
Not really. I mean, I think the history of wealth taxes have shown that one of the reasons we have income taxes rather than wealth taxes is that wealth taxes are very hard to collect, really, because if you're a very wealthy person, the odds are most of your wealth are in assets that are very hard to value, like art or private equity. And in fact, once you start taxing wealth, it's a lot, people have an incentive to put their assets in things that are harder to value. That's why most countries have dropped a wealth tax and where we have an income tax. And it's interesting. Europe has much higher income taxes than the US, as opposed to we actually do have an estate tax, which I agree we should, is a good tax thing. I'm not against estate taxes as a wealth tax. But you actually see in Europe, you see more of a perpetuation of wealth across generations than you do in America, just because they have much higher income taxes. So it's a lot harder to become a self-made wealthy person or sort of build dynastic wealth in Europe compared to America because of the high income taxes versus wealth taxes.
Gary?
Well, I mean, I think there's going to be an area of agreement. It seems like broadly Alison agrees that it would be better to move tax away from income and towards wealth. So perhaps there's an area of agreement there. I don't know what Alison's background is, but I suspect if you were to ask Americans from poor backgrounds living today, they would say it's very difficult to move from a position of being born in a family that doesn't have assets to anything like financial security, especially when you look at what's happened to house prices. I mean, here in the UK, I come from a poor background, but I've got friends who very smart guys, great degrees, great jobs. They'll never be able to own property. And that is because those properties are being bought by kids from rich families who are getting £300,000, £400,000 from their parents to buy properties. I mean, the situation that we're in is pretty absurd, really, when my friends are working hard, making £50,000, £60,000 a year, paying 40% income tax, whereas children from rich families are receiving millions of pounds from their parents, paying nothing, buying all the properties. You end up with an absurd situation, which really, it's not capitalism at all, is it? It's kind of a new inherited feudalism. I'm sure people who are listening to this call will understand it's not just the UK and the US. In countries across the world, it's becoming increasingly impossible, if you're born in the wrong family, to aspire to something even as simple as owning your own home.
Alison, what's your response to that? Because, I mean, to be fair, according to the 2021 Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report, the world's richest 1%, those with more than $1 million, own nearly half the world's wealth. Surely there is some tax to be had there.
Well, as I said, wealth taxes are very hard. They're largely impractical and honestly self-defeating. They can even make wealth inequality worse in a lot of ways because it creates an incentive to not go public with your wealth because it becomes easier to value. So people who, more people than ever participate in the stock market. So it really does not solve the problem. I agree that it's a huge problem that people cannot buy property or buying homes. But the solution to that isn't to tax wealth, which, as I said, is incredibly hard to raise revenue doing. It's to make it easier to build property. The real sort of hurdle to sort of making housing more affordable is all those restrictions we have on building. It seems like, as I said, it's definitely a problem that young people today are feeling like it's harder to get a foothold and establish themselves. Global poverty in a lot of countries is a huge issue. But inequality isn't the cause of that. There's solutions we can have where we can all get richer together.
I mean, some might argue, Gary, that owning your own property is not a dream in all countries globally. That there are many countries where people live their lives perfectly happy, renting. The rental market is affordable for many people. Is it about owning your own property? Is being the king of your own castle what everyone wants?
I come from a family, but I studied at the London School of Economics here in London and at Oxford University. And I've heard a lot of economists make this argument that owning your own property is not important. One thing I always notice about those people is they're always property owning families. Listen, where I'm from, my friends who are earning maybe 2-3 times national average income, they're worried if they'll ever be able to have kids. That's the situation that we're in here. So, I don't know if you own your own property. I don't know if Alison owns hers. I own mine, and if I have a family, I'll be able to look after them. But we're raising a generation of young people here who, no matter what uni they go to, what they study, are worried about whether they're able to afford to have a family. So listen, of course homes are important. Of course they are.
Alison, let me bring you back in here. Do you think that there are any countries or places in the world that we can point to, who you could point to and say, look, that's the way to do it. They're doing it right there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no country is perfect, but I wouldn't say America or Canada or Europe are doing it so badly. I mean, are they perfect? No. Are there big policy changes I would like to see? Absolutely. But I think I think the rise in prosperity and living standards in the last century has been just really astounding. So clearly we are doing something right as well.
Gary, what do you think?
I mean, the obvious thing to say to that, if you compare now to 100 years ago, wealth inequality has collapsed now versus 100 years ago. And that is why living standards have massively increased. You know, if you compare now to the 1920s, quality is enormously less, and that is why living standards are enormously more. But if you compare now to, for example, 50 years ago, where in both the UK and the US, top rates of both estate taxes and income taxes were significantly higher, that was an age where, if I look at my parents, you know, my dad worked for the post office, right, for 35 years, never went to university. He was able to buy a home, have 3 kids, and he owns that home outright now, you know. That was possible 50 years ago when inequality was less. Now, you know, 50 years later, we've invented the internet, and you have families where both parents have degrees and cannot afford to have a family. So in 100 years, quality of life has got massively better and inequality has decreased. But in the last 50 years, especially the last 30 years, where we've seen rapid increases in inequality, in very obvious, real, important ways, it is very clear, especially to young people, that life has materially gotten worse. And you will not find any young person from a poor family on an average income who will disagree with that.
Why is that, Gary? Why do you believe life has got materially worse?
In my opinion, it's because of wealth inequality. I'm not just saying this. It was my job to bet on this, right? I was an interest rates trader after 2008. And my job was to forecast, will we have a strong recovery after 2008? And I saw the markets predict a recovery in 2009. That didn't happen. In 2010, that didn't happen. 2011, that didn't happen. 2012, that didn't happen. And every single year up to 2020, markets said, we will see interest rates recover next year. And it never happened. And for me, I think I was in a unique position, right? Because I'm from a poor background, and I won my job in a card competition to get a job as a trader. So I was one of the only people there, despite being from East London, where the financial area is. I was one of the only people there from a poor background working in that space. And I could see that the government policies that were supposed to bring about a recovery, like, for example, zero interest rates and quantitative easing, I could see that they were doing nothing for the people that I grew up with in the area that I was living. All they were doing were pushing house prices up, which was squeezing ordinary families out of the ability to own a property and out of the ability to have a home. You know, I really, really wish Alison was right, that we could improve broad prosperity and decrease poverty without doing something about wealth inequality. I really, really could. But I'm a millionaire. I've been retired for more than 5 years now on the basis that I bet it's not possible. And I'm afraid it's not. And if we don't fix it, I'll keep betting on it and I'll make millions of more pounds, but we will send billions of people into poverty.
Alison, what's your response to that?
There's a lot to unpack there. Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think just because there's a correlation with falling inequality and rising prosperity, I don't think you can claim causation. A lot of other things happen there. Also, sort of even while inequality has risen, I mean, I'd say the quality of most people's lives has risen quite a lot. I mean, I think quality of life is significantly higher for most people, for almost everyone since the 1980s. I mean, in almost every measure, life is better. And I think as well, it's odd that so many people feel they cannot afford to have children. I mean, people have always had children with a lot less resources. I think it is just indicative of how much higher standards we have of living, that people feel like they cannot have children sort of with what they have, just because the standards of what you need to raise a child in their own head has increased. But that just shows how much higher our living standards have increased. And I think it's just the idea that we're going to do this massive wealth redistribution. It's crazy. As I said, there's never been a country that's effectively done wealth taxes. I mean, I said income taxes work better, but even very high income taxes, I said, you get a lot more evasion. I said, we need to tax what we can actually value, and it's very, very hard to value wealth. So it sort of is just a non-starter that we're going to do massive wealth redistribution, even if you like it. Although, to be honest, I don't think it's very good, because it discourages the things that do increase prosperity, like innovation, like starting businesses. This is what increases growth in a sustainable way, because sustainable growth is also important. Rising living standards are important. This is what makes people better off. It's not how much one person has, which is what another person has. It's that everyone is relieved from poverty and doing better.
Is that the case, Gary?
I mean, of course, that is what's important. Yeah, bringing people out of poverty is what's important. But allowing the rich to get richer and richer and richer brought people out of poverty. We wouldn't have any poor people. You know, in the last 3 years, we've seen the biggest and fastest ever increase in millionaire and billionaire wealth. You know, the average billionaire in the US doubled their wealth in the first single year of COVID. We've never seen such a massive increase in wealth of the richest. And what has happened immediately after that? An absolute collapse in living standards for ordinary people. Ultimately, you have to accept there's a certain amount of resources here, and if you give more and more of it to rich people, you are going to hurt the poor. And listen, it's not zero-sum game. Of course, I want to grow the economy. Of course, I want to grow the economy. But we've spent 15 years now trying to grow the economy by giving tons of money to rich people. And what has happened? You can claim as much as you like that living standards have increased for ordinary people. Find me someone from a family without assets on average income who is telling you that their life is great now. It's almost impossible to just taking care of in this country, in the UK, we are going to see half the country this winter not be able to afford to heat their homes. How can you tell me things are getting better? People are worried about feeding their kids, and we're not even just talking about the bottom 10, 20% here. We're talking about big chunks of society in the richest countries in the world. That is what happens when you give all of your wealth to the rich.
Okay, well, thank you for that. If you're just joining us, we are having a Twitter space debate about wealth inequality. And I know that many of you have been tweeting us your questions and your comments. We've had a tweet from the Asima Rehman, who says global wealth inequality can be addressed by introducing a global wealth tax system. So that could be an idea to think about. Andrew Barrett says, do we need more financial education in the UK for the middle classes, in particular, to buy and own shares and stocks and businesses they spend their money in? And Gatkik Biel says, when you talk about physical assets as durable, do these assets also act as collateral security and financial security in case of any global economic breakdown, like inflation and the failure of capital market performance? Alison, if you could answer any of those.
Well, I mean, I think while a global wealth tax sounds very appealing, it is, just as I said, highly unrealistic. No country's ever effectively been able to tax wealth, as I said, because it's very hard to value, which is why economists tend to favor things like consumption taxes or income taxes, because it's not only very inefficient, and by inefficient, I mean distortionary, it is also just practically very hard to collect, particularly at a global level where you don't have any one jurisdiction. So I think, while it's a nice idea in some ways, I think it is largely realistic. But I do really think it would be great to have more financial education certainly for everyone, upper and middle and lower class.
Gary, do you have any response to those tweets?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's something we agree on, me and Alison. It would be great to have a global wealth tax. I wish we had that level of global unity that we could do that. It would be difficult, but I don't think it's impossible at all. If you look at my country, the UK, most countries in Europe, the US, even Japan now, they have real estate taxes that work, that are not avoidable to some degree. But we've created a system where increasingly to the very rich, they are avoidable. That was not always true. So, if we look at the past, the 50s, 60s, we had estate taxes that were not avoidable. It is possible to do it. We can send a man to the moon. We can tax the rich if we try and do it. I think it's important to realize if we don't do it, how bad things are going to be. With regards to financial education, I've got to take the opportunity to advertise my YouTube channel, because it's entirely about explaining to people what is happening to the economy, what is happening to the financial situation of ordinary families. So it's Gary's Economics. It's there to educate people basically on what is happening in the economy. And with regards to the physical assets provide security, I mean, yes, 100%. If you are living in Europe now and you own your own property, you are massively more secure than if you don't. So, if you do have assets, do as much as you can to hold on to them. I know that poorer families, especially who are seeing cost of living going up, are probably going to get pushed into a situation where they have to sell their homes. And I understand in some cases that will be unavoidable. For me, that's another consequence and a symptom of wealth inequality rising. But yeah, if you can get physical assets, especially a home to live in, it massively protects your financial position.
I want to bring in someone else at this point, someone who is part of the Doha Debates Ambassador Program, Ezuku Fab Emeranini. He is an ambassador from the Doha Debates Program, and it's a first of its kind initiative for change makers from all over the world. And if you want to find out more about it, you can visit at Doha. You can visit at dohadebate.com. But I wanted to bring you in, Ezuku, to ask a question to the guests. Go ahead. I think we may be having a technical issue with Ezuku's microphone. Are we able to try one more time? If not, then I can ask you his question, if that's okay. Ezuku says, I'm from Nigeria, and I believe that the economic impact of colonialism and slave trade can still be felt in countries around the world, even today. Do you think the West has a moral responsibility to implement economic policies that reduce wealth inequality and repair some of the damage they did in the past? If so, what would these economic policies look like? If I could go to you first, Gary.
Oh man, it's a big question. I have to admit, first of all, I'm not an expert on the Nigerian economy. I understand that there's significant problems with poverty there. I think, of course, richer countries in general do have a responsibility to help poorer countries, especially countries where poverty is a big issue. The problem is I'm sitting here now in the UK, and this winter, half of the country is going to struggle to heat their homes. We're talking about 30–40% of people struggling to feed their kids. If that is the political situation you're in, it's going to be very hard to turn around to the people of this country and say, you need to help the people of Nigeria. And 100%, I think richer countries should be helping poorer countries. But whilst you are seeing poverty exploding in the richer countries, it becomes completely politically impossible, I'm afraid. So, listen, I would like to reduce poverty in every country, but unfortunately, unless I reduce it here, there's no way I'm going to be able to build support for it. So good luck to your guest.
Alison.
I mean, yeah, I think we owe something to sort of a lot of these countries, not only for history, but just as fellow humans. But I think the way to do it isn't necessarily direct wealth transfers, although, development programs sometimes when implemented can be useful. But I think, as I said, is to further opening the global economy, trading more of these countries, letting more of their people immigrate to our shores, I think is really the best way to sort of lift all boats.
Okay. Let me ask you both. People talk about wealth inequality, but they also talk about the environment. They talk about climate change. They talk about how that can increase inequality. The effects of climate change can increase inequality. And what do you think, my two guests, is the link between wealth inequality and climate change? And how do we go about trying to solve both issues simultaneously without impacting one of them in a negative way? Alison.
Well, I think honestly, the answer is more innovation, because innovation historically is how we get more using fewer resources. So really, innovation is going to be really critical to being a more green, environmentally friendly economy. So that is going to require, as I said, encouraging people to sort of innovate, to start new businesses. And as I said, wealth taxes historically sort of run counter to that. So I think we should be less concerned with inequality and more about how we can promote innovation so we can have a greener economy.
Gary.
I think that's an excellent question. I'm an economist. I'm not an expert on climate change or the environment, but obviously I'm very interested. What interests me most is why we, as a global society, have so failed to push back against this. And I wanted to know more about it, right? So I've got a friend who was campaigning for the Green Party, which people will know is a environmentally climate change focused party here in the UK. He was campaigning for them in 2015, and I went out with him just to see what people were saying. And it was in Stratford, which is close to where I live and close to where I'm from in East London. It's a very poor area. Everyone we spoke to said the same thing. They said, listen, I'm struggling to feed my kids here, and you're telling me I need to worry about the global environment. So the way I see it, in a sense, it's similar to the Nigeria question, which is that there are things which are vitally important for us to achieve as a planet. But whilst you are, even in rich countries, pushing more and more people into serious poverty where they're worried about taking care of their families, you can understand why it becomes impossible to achieve unity on those bigger aims. So for me, in my opinion, as someone who's made millions betting that inequality would create this poverty, I think until we deal with that inequality and fix that poverty, unfortunately, our chances of dealing with these bigger problems become very slim.
That's very interesting, Gary. We've had a comment from one Twitter follower, Zeddy Economist, Zambian economist at Zeddy Economist. And they say, incredibly engrossing to hear the first world perspective on this. All discussions are dead end. International corporate taxation and Western extractivism should be the number one issues and not necessarily wealth taxes. What's your reaction to that, Alison? What he's talking about here, what they're talking about here is we're talking about this from a first world perspective.
So, I mean, I think he brings up a really good point that, we tend to be very first world about this and become obsessed with inequality within our own countries without really thinking about global inequality and how one that has really fallen over the years, and that's been a great achievement, really hasn't gone far enough. And thinking more about, as I said, how to make the global economy a lot more inclusive. And, as I said, I think a lot of what we've been doing with the Millennium Development Goals have really worked well, and other things haven't. So I think we need to, as I said, think of this more as a global problem.
Gary, is that the way forward, to think of it as a global problem? I mean, if you're not going to be able to tax wealth within your own country, how easy is it going to be to do it globally?
I think it would be great if we could think of it as a global problem, because, I'm an expert on richer world economies, Europe, North America, Japan, and really everywhere I look, you're seeing the same things happening. Wealth inequality is increasing, housing is becoming less affordable, basic cost of living is becoming higher relative to regular wages. So really, I think it's a global problem. And even in countries, as Alison says, a lot of countries which were much poorer have grown, but they themselves also have problems with inequality and poverty. So I see this as a global problem. But the problem is, as I've said a few times on this call, because poverty is growing so much in the richer parts of the world, that creates this real sense of instability. And, because I'm from a poor background, I see it. I know people whose parents had secure financial lives with homes, whose kids will never be able to have those things. And when you're turning around to young people who are worried about how they're going to be able to take care of their kids, it's very, very difficult to turn around and tell them, there are problems in Nigeria, there are problems in Zambia. And I'm not at all trying to undermine those problems. I know those problems are there. But until you create financial security in any country, it becomes very, very, very difficult to get people for bigger aims. But it's fascinating to hear these people from countries I don't know much about telling me the situation in their country.
I want to give our guests a break for a minute or two and talk to our listeners about our Doha Debates poll. We asked people on Twitter a few questions, and we have had some interesting answers, and I want to bring one in particular. We asked the question, what's the most effective way to close the wealth gap? Is it to tax the rich? Is it lower taxes? Is it universal pay, basic income, or to pay women more? And we had the majority of people, by a hair's breadth actually, talking about universal basic income as being the best way to close the wealth gap. And I'm interested to find out, Alison, whether you believe that UBI could be an option.
Well, it could be an option, but it's not a very good one.
Why?
Well, as I said, it's very important, as I said, to have people participating in the economy and working. And UBI, as I said, I think we've seen some evidence now from the pandemic, is that it discourages work. And, it depends also how you implement it, whether or not it's going to be on top of existing social welfare programs or replace them. I think in either case, it's not a good option. If you're doing it on top of existing social welfare programs, it's prohibitively expensive. So if you're going to give people enough money to really make a meaningful difference in their life on top of the social welfare programs we already have, as I said, it's incredibly expensive. We see it sort of distorts sort of labor market decisions. I think it's better to do more targeted welfare to people who really need it. It's a lot more efficient. It's a lot cheaper. And as I said, it's a lot better to get people fully participating in the economy.
Gary?
I think you might have finally found something that to some degree we agree on. I think UBI is a really interesting idea. And if anyone doesn't know what it is, universal basic income, it's giving a fixed amount of money to basically everyone in the country every month, every week, whatever. It's a super interesting idea, but my concern with the UBI is, if you think about it, it's quite similar to a welfare state. A welfare state is a kind of a UBS, universal basic services. We give everyone healthcare, education, things like this. But we are currently definitely in the UK and a lot of other rich world countries, we are decreasing the welfare state. So if you're going to bring in a UBI, it's going to be expensive. And if the context is you are already cutting back the welfare state, there is a risk that the end result is, as Alison mentioned, you bring in the UBI at the expense of getting rid of your welfare state. And the welfare state provides targeted support to the people who are most in need, whereas the UBI is very indiscriminate. It gives everyone a constant sum of money. So the end result of that is you would be taking money away in many cases from single mums, disabled people, people who are unable to work. You'd be taking money away from the poorest people in society to give it in many cases to millionaires like me who don't need it. So I think if you were to fund it, for example, with a wealth tax, I think that would be fantastic. But my concern is if we're not careful about how we talk about it, we could open the space for dismantling the welfare state and replacing it with a UBI, and that would end up being a worse system.
Thank you for that. We've had more and more tweets coming in, and I want to read out a couple before we move on. Ronita, who's at Ron's1212, says social business can reduce wealth inequalities along with solving one of the most pressing social problems like poverty, affordable housing, healthcare, education, livelihood, all aiming at sustainable development of this planet. And Prout Swomi says, among almost all regions of the world have the necessary resources to raise standard of living, but it requires a different approach. The West has been prosperous for centuries, greatly at the cost of the poor. Sure, there can be some compensation, but it is not the solution. So thank you to everyone who has been tweeting us. I wanted to ask both my guests, Alison and Gary, is there a question, having heard each other's opinions now for the last 30 minutes or so, is there a question that you have for one another, for each other, something that you'd like to ask each other based on what you've heard so far? Gary, is there any burning question that you have to ask Alison before we come to the conclusion of this debate?
There's lots of questions I'd like to ask, but I think that the one which I'll go with is I'm sitting here as an economist, as a trader who bets on the economy getting worse and worse. And I'm looking at the economy now getting massively more unequal. And I think in the next 5-6 years, we're going to really see living standards fall because we don't see inequality decreasing. It sounds like Alison is more optimistic. And I would like to get her to come out and tell us that if she thinks life will get better, because I think 5-6 years down the line, if we don't fix inequality, she might look back on it.
I'm hopeful life will get better. I mean, it has historically. I am concerned it won't, really not because inequality will get worse, but because I said I see us sort of pulling back on trade. I see us becoming a lot more insular as economies, and historically that has impoverished countries. So I think we have the potential to keep growing. I just hope we make the choices that are consistent with that.
Fantastic. Alison, do you have a question you'd like to ask Gary?
Yeah, I'm curious sort of how you would implement a wealth tax.
I think a wealth tax specifically, in my opinion, would probably be best targeted at very high net worth individuals. For the reasons you say, it is a little bit expensive to implement. But if you look at people with above £10 million, which would be something like, I think, $11 million, in those instances, the cost of administration would be significantly less than the amount of money you could get. You know, realistically, these assets are valuable. And if you're looking at very high net wealth individuals, then I think it would definitely pay for itself many, many times over. But there are other ways you could do it. I've got an idea on my website, wealtheconomics.org, which is about a wealth time limit, which doesn't involve valuation. The truth is, I'm agnostic about how you do it. But if you do not do something to reverse these rapid increases in inequality, I'm very confident you're going to see very serious and broad falls in standard of living. So something has to be done.
Okay, well, thank you to you both. If you're just joining us, well, you are nearing the end of the discussion. If you've missed this conversation but want to listen back to the full recording, it'll be available on our Twitter page as soon as the live stream ends. And we encourage you to listen to the debate and, of course, as always, let us know what you think. Now, we have been discussing these differing viewpoints in the spirit of having authentic, respectful debate, and I think that we've done very well at that. I'd like to ask our speakers, though, before we end proceedings, if there's one thing you have heard today that made you pause or even, dare I say it, made you think differently to how you thought when you first started this debate, what would that be? And Alison, if I could ask you that.
Well, I mean, I think from Gary, I'm really sensing a sense of fear in the UK. And, you know, I lived there for a long time. It's a country I really considered home and feel a lot of attachment to. And it makes me actually very worried for what's ahead in the months there.
Okay. And Gary, is there anything that you have heard today that has made you pause, or anything that Alison has said or that you've heard today that has made you think differently?
Oh, well, Alison's been very respectful, and I think she makes a lot of points that are correct. You know, a wealth tax will be difficult. But, you know, I look at these things every day and I'm well aware of that. But, you know, a lot of things are difficult. Sending a man to the moon was difficult. You know, fighting against terrorism is difficult. You know, taking people out of poverty is difficult. I'm sitting here looking at the economy. If we don't do this, we are going to see an explosion of poverty all across the world, and it will not reverse. So it's difficult, but it's worth doing.
And one quick tweet from racecourse_kid. They say, can cryptocurrencies end income equality? Gary, can cryptocurrencies end income equality?
I'm sorry, I wish they could, but I very, very much doubt it.
Alison?
No, in fact, I worry they might have worsened it by the sort of people who got in right before it fell, where it tended to be the lower income people.
Okay, well, listen, that was so good to talk to you both. Alison and Gary, it's been really good to have you both on the show and to debate. And of course, as always, you kept your arguments very respectful. And I think we learned a lot about both of your viewpoints on wealth inequality. And we got an insight into what our Twitter followers think about that topic too. As I said earlier, you're more than welcome to listen to this debate again as soon as this live stream is over. We'll encourage you to listen to the debate. And as always, let us know what you think. Thank you to both of you. And of course, thank you to our audience. Doha Debates will be back on Twitter Spaces in just a couple of weeks' time with a conversation about social media and mental health. Now, while you wait, do go to the Doha Debates website and check out some of our other content. You can listen to podcasts. This week, for example, there's new episodes of The Negotiators and the first episode of a new season of The Long Game. You can also go to our YouTube channel to watch our full debates, and you can also sign up to our newsletter at the website dohadebates.com. But for all of you who have been listening and taking part, thank you and bye-bye.